Dobry вечер and welcome back to Otamama for this live stream on this geopolitics channel on our client inside Ukraine. You can see I'm actually back here in Ukraine. As always, for these live streams, at least the last few, got the iconic Odessa Opera House right behind me. I'm wearing a t-shirt. I wonder if I can find, maybe I can't really translate it there. It says, "Oh, be Ukraine." And that is what Vladimir Putin is now terrified of. And that's in part why we have seen this new escalation by Russia in terms of increased bombing attacks on the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. We have seen, I guess it was 2 nights ago, the metro station, I think it's called Lukyanska, the area, as well as many other civilian objects being hit by Russia in a huge barrage of missiles and drones. As I have aligned to you in several videos here on this channel, the shoot-down rate by Ukraine of Russian drones has increased quite a lot. I remember back in, I guess it was 2022, when they first started using these Shahid drones that they adopted, the Russians that they got from Iran. The shoot-down rate wasn't very high. I don't even think it was over 50% back then. Now, this summer, around 95%. However, the number of drones that Russia fires has also dramatically increased. So basically, that means that more stuff probably overall gets through just because of the amount that is being thrown at Ukraine. And we have seen the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, warn, amongst other Russian officials, warn foreign diplomats and officials who are based in the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, to evacuate because they intend to strike several targets. They say decision-making centers. Then I saw in the Russian media that there's some debate about what exactly is a decision-making center. Apparently, it's not actually the governmental building. So it seemed like they were even trying to walk that back a little bit. So we all seen China get involved. They made a public statement, which is quite unusual, say basically dissuading or attempting to dissuade Russia from these kind of attacks that we've seen over the last few days, or at least that are again threatened to happen imminently on Kyiv. And the big question is, why now? This war has been going on since 2014, since Russia invaded Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass region, and then escalated in 2022 with an attempt to seize power in Kyiv. I call it the extended invasion, some others call it full-scale invasion. So why are they increasing the barrages, and now why in the summer of 2026? They are making almost no progress on the front lines, which would be the first time this happens since 2023. Basically, Ukraine liberated a lot of territory towards the end of 2022, and then there was the expectation for the summer of 2023 that Ukraine would continue with a summer offensive. However, the summer offensive wasn't as successful as had been hoped by the Ukrainians. And since then, Russia has basically had a system where they encourage a lot of soldiers to sign up for large remuneration, and then they just suffer huge casualties as a result. And this has meant that they have taken slivers of Ukrainian territory piecemeal over about a 3-year period, a couple of percentage points of Ukraine's total territory. However, as I had anticipated and outlined on my two channels, even back in 2020, late 2023 and early 2024, towards the end of 2025, they hit three major issues: money, men, and materiel. So now the Ukrainians say, as we're almost at the halfway point in 2026, Russians are losing more soldiers per month, that's killed in action, wounded in action, missing in action, than they were able to recruit. So the Russian army, or the Russian armed forces, are actually getting smaller. They've already burned through so much of their Soviet-era stockpile, and the war has evolved with this drone warfare since 2023 that basically it's pretty hard to drive armored vehicles right up to the front line anymore because they just get swarmed by drones and destroyed. So that has been, to a certain extent, negated their materiel advantage. They still have it in some capacity, but is dramatically reduced. There was a time where I think they were firing like 7 or 8 shells for every one shell the Ukrainians were firing in return, but it's not that kind of war anymore. And most importantly, money-wise, the Russian economy, they can fudge the numbers in Moscow any way they want, but it's been in recession since probably the second half of 2025. So those three issues came to a head at the end of last year, and Russia hasn't found a solution. And things have only gotten worse from now. They make almost no progress in terms of territory on the front line. Ukraine has actually been launching a series of counterattacks in the last 6 months or so that have meant that it's kind of negated those Russian gains almost entirely. They're on an Ukrainians are on a counteroffensive or a counterattack, more serious counterattacks in Zaporizhia Oblast along the river Dnipro. And let's put this whole over here. Big gust of wind almost took away my other microphone. So the Ukrainians have been on a series of counterattacks down in the very south of Ukraine. And this has meant that Russia now, just on the map, doesn't seem to be making any that much anticipation to turn things around. There's no sign that Russia is about to do something dramatic right now in terms of tactical or technological development that would suddenly tide on the battlefield. If anything, it's going against them. Their economy is in a lot of trouble. They can sell off reserves in the short run. Obviously, the oil price has gone up a bit with this war in the Middle East. That probably will come to some sort of conclusion pretty shortly with the US midterms coming up. Wouldn't be in Trump's interest to have huge, very high oil prices during the elections for the Republican Party. So I expect something to happen within the next 2 months that would reduce them again. And in any case, Ukraine has stepped up its attacks on Russia's ability to take advantage of the higher oil prices by targeting their export and production capacity for oil as well. So all these things mean that Putin is facing some very hard choices. He could go for a mobilization in Russia. The time he did that back in 2022, in the autumn of 2022, was extremely unpopular. They mobilized 300,000 men, but 1 million Russian men left the country. And if he does that again, who knows how many would leave. They've been trying to crack down on the ability of Russians to communicate with apps and just the mobile internet in general in Russia for a few months in anticipation probably of, I think there's some sort of local election. Not that it will be a free and fair election, but still, it could be a time where people would mobilize together to protest. And if there were mobilization before that or just afterwards, then probably coalesce in a lot of activity that will be hostile to Putin's regime, because there is no daylight at the end of the tunnel. There's no path to victory at the moment. And if he goes for mobilization, it is likely to be extremely unpopular amongst the public in Russia. They don't really care, vast majority of them, about horrendous war crimes against Ukrainians or killing them, but they don't want to see their economy go down and get poorer and poorer, and then be forced against their will to go and fight and die, presumably in a war for Putin's delusions of imperial grandeur. So that is why we see him consider other ways to escalate. The increased attacks on Ukraine is one, more outrageous in terms of murdering civilians. That has proven to be Russia's modus operandi, say in Chechnya, when they crushed the quasi-independent, I think it was called the Korean Republic in the early 90s, when the de jure territory of the Russian Federation. Also in Syria, they destroyed cities and tried to destroy the morale of Syrians to resist them and their allies, which was the government, the Assad government at the time. And they have tried that here. However, historically, that doesn't in general work. It just means that the public is more together in resisting the aggressor, which in this case is the Russian Federation. So it's more likely to help Ukrainians coalesce around a goal, which is to prevent and prevent Russia from taking over and defeat the Russian forces rather than dissuade them to give up. It is a way of, in a way, possibly of shoring up some support in Russia by just demonstrating they can go and kill lots of Ukrainians and blow things up. Maybe that works. It's very hard for me to say from over here in Ukraine whether that makes people want to support the government more or not. Could be the case. I have been expecting this to come in terms of more outrageous barrages of war crimes through these missiles and drone attacks as we get closer and closer to the end of this phase of the war, where Russia starts and Putin starts to run out of options, that he will go for these increasingly wild escalations. The Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is under Russian control and occupied Kherson Oblast it's in the Zaporizhia Oblast. Should be, I guess. It's just around the bend there on the Dnipro River in Volga. And that could be the next potential escalation by indicating that they're about to create some sort of accident at the plant, something resembling Chernobyl. We did see Russians destroy the Novokhovka Dam, which is further up on the river Dnipro. It's actually down from the river, I think, on the map, but it's north of Kherson, the city. I've been there myself, obviously before the occupation, and they denied that for months until they actually published their own footage blowing it up. So I could see some sort of movement to claim that they're going to do something else and try to scare everybody into not supporting Ukraine surrender, otherwise we'll blow the whole place up. Kind of madman, game of chicken in game theory attempt. I think that we've seen indications from China already that they are not happy with Russia behaving this way. And at the moment, Russia is increasingly becoming a vassal of China as they become more and more dependent on China to basically give them money and buy their resources. And at the end of the day, not be against them and maybe take their territory, because Russia obviously is in a very weak state with all its troops, well, so many of its troops in Ukraine. And it's got this huge border with China, which is sparsely populated. And it's always been a long-term, long-standing security concern of Russia, the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union before it. We even had a short-lived border war. It was in the 1950s. So China is a threat to Russia, and Russia is increasingly dependent on them. So can't imagine that if the Chinese are already making public statements against these current missile barrages in Kyiv, that they're going to be in favor of Russia bringing some sort of nuclear action or even threatening and using this nuclear blackmail. But that is something that I expect to see as well in the coming months as Putin ponders what other options he has. He could go for an even, and it depends how you view a nuclear accident versus an attack on a NATO state, one that's plausibly deniable. So a little bit like the Crimean scenario where they sent groups, a small number of Spetsnaz with no insignia. So, and they take over some town on the border inside Estonia or Latvia, maybe. And then Russia says, we don't know who those people are. I guess they're using the latest drone technology and have tanks or whatever that are exactly the same as Russian ones. But they'll just say, we don't know who those people are. And then they'll wait to see what the other NATO states do. That could be a way of trying to take back the initiative by demonstrating a strategic win. For example, if U.S. does not send troops to eject those Russian forces, sends moral support or something, then that would basically negate the raison d'etre for NATO in general, since its main reason to exist is the U.S. providing a security umbrella for Europe. And obviously, quid pro quo, U.S. has those military bases in Europe that they can use for forward power projection, and they Europeans have been historically just buying lots of U.S. weapons rather than making them themselves. So that has been the agreement, or a lot of it just informal understanding between two sides. But if Putin is able to demonstrate that that doesn't exist, that could prove to be a strategic achievement of his. The problem is that I would expect for sure that enough of the other NATO members, they would react and send troops, and maybe even Ukraine. I'd actually expect Ukraine also to send troops, and they would liberate that territory quite quickly, and that would look like another humiliating defeat for the Russians. no matter what Donald Trump decides to, he may even decide to send troops at the end of the day, although I think that's very unlikely. And having spoken to lots of people on both sides of the political spectrum, almost no one expects him to do that. So that would be another escalation he could go for. But this is probably going to be the first. It's hard to say that this is actually the first, as Russia escalates effectively all the time, and the whole war is illegal, and they should just go home to end it. But nonetheless, I would expect to see more and more bombing in the short run while while the Russian leadership ponders what to do as they run out of options. This war gets worse and worse for them. The problem for Putin with respect to war is he needs to stay in power. So, according to the Russian ultranationalist Igor Gerkin, who cited quite a lot, and last year I discussed him because we saw it almost impossible for Russia to win the war back in 2025. Two scenarios: mainly Ukraine either takes back its territory and basically wins a complete victory, or we have just an uneasy kind of truce, temporary truce, while both sides rearm and get ready for the next phase of the war. He now thinks he's sitting in a Russian prison because Vladimir Putin still doesn't think he can get rid of him, apparently completely, but doesn't want him out walking around on the streets. Igor Gerkin thinks that at this point, even civilization won't win the war for Russia, just prolong it basically and buy Russia some time. But basically, it's almost pointless, and that Putin has effectively